Hi, everybody. I'm Jim Siegel, and I have a business that provides strategic insights. I seek to go beyond the headlines, beyond the press releases, beyond the typical media coverage to understand the context, the background of today's hot topics. In this video, I would like to examine a frequently cited but often misunderstood document, the United States Constitution. Now, we just concluded a rather ugly 2020 presidential campaign. I noticed many candidates, pundits, and media personalities citing the Constitution to defend their point of view. Some were valid, some were stretching the truth, some were deliberately misleading, and others were outright falsehoods. But we are left to decide who's right and who's wrong. Having a copy of the Constitution is a good start, but in my opinion, it's not enough. We must understand why the Constitution was written, what principles the Founding Fathers had in mind, why certain aspects are included or not included. I have selected a few entertaining and interesting videos to provide insight to the Constitution. Videos featuring several educators and lecturers. And these provide context and insight into the Constitution, aspects that are rarely discussed these days, but crucially important. Let's get started first with this clip from a collection of videos under the banner History with Mrs. H.
The 13 colonies declared independence in 1776, they needed to create a government to run their new country. The Continental Congress created the Articles of Confederation in 1777. The Articles of Confederation were a reaction to the British government's actions leading to the American Revolution. The colonists saw the executive, or King George III, as having too much power, and believed that power should lie with their local assemblies. Remember, in the Declaration, almost all the grievances begin with the word he, referring to the king. Because of this, the government created by the Articles of Confederation had no executive branch. There was nothing like a president or a king to oversee the government. It also had no national court system. The Articles of Confederation only created a national Congress. Each state would elect members to the Congress, but each state only got one vote, regardless of the state's population. In order to pass a law, 9 of the 13 states had to agree, and to amend or change the Articles of Confederation, all 13 states needed to agree. The Articles of Confederation gave Congress limited powers, like they could conduct foreign affairs, maintain the armed forces, borrow money, issue currency, create a postal system, and declare war or make peace. According to the Articles of Confederation, all powers not explicitly given to the National Congress were left for the states. This means the National Congress could not impose taxes, regulate trade between the states or with other countries, or create an army or navy. In effect, it was like the United States was 13 independent countries, all of them doing whatever they wanted. This presented some challenges for the national government. As you can see, the Articles of Confederation gave the government very limited power, and there were some massive flaws. These flaws were fully exposed in 1786, when Daniel Shays led an armed revolt against the government of Massachusetts in response to taxation laws. Daniel Shays was a former soldier in the Continental Army and was a farmer living in Massachusetts. The state kept raising taxes and taking away farms when people couldn't pay their debts. Daniel Shays was very upset by this system. He himself had been taken to court in 1780 because he had not paid his debts while he'd been fighting in the American Revolution. Remember, the government couldn't pay him because they couldn't raise taxes. In the fall of 1786, he led an armed revolt with over 5,000 followers against the Massachusetts government. Their goal was to stop the courts from meeting, which led to them burning down some courthouses. Remember, the national government had no power to raise an army, so it was up to the Massachusetts militia to stop the rebellion. Other states began to see what was going on in Massachusetts and realized the government needed to change. They didn't want a rebellion like that in their state. So, in the summer of 1787, 55 delegates from 12 states, Rhode Island refused to send anyone, met in Philadelphia to fix the Articles of Confederation. Many of the all-stars from the time were at the Constitutional Convention, including George Washington, who served as the president of the convention, James Madison from Virginia, Benjamin Franklin, who was the oldest delegate at 81 years old, and newcomer Alexander Hamilton. There were several notable people who were not at the convention, like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, who were both serving as ambassadors to France and Great Britain at the time. After arriving in Philadelphia, the delegates made 3 decisions. First, they realized they couldn't fix the Articles of Confederation. They were beyond repair, they were that much of a mess. So they tossed them out and started over. Second, they agreed each state would get 1 vote, regardless of the state's population or the size of the delegation sent to the convention. Finally, they agreed to keep the proceedings private for 30 years, so the delegates could speak freely without fear of judgment from those back home.
Now let's take a look at what core beliefs influenced the Founding Fathers and the writers of the Constitution. This video features Jake McCauley, a lecturer who created a popular series explaining the Constitution.
As we begin Lecture 3, we're going to discuss the major influences on the Founding Fathers. To do that, of course, we bring up the Bible. Last week we looked at the study that Dr. Lutz and Dr. Heinemann did. We found that 34% of quotations from our framers came from the Bible. Secondly, we have human authors that are most quoted. Baron Charles Montesquieu, who was a French Catholic, was quoted 8.3%. He was the most quoted human author. His main work was The Spirit of the Laws, written in 1748, and his main contributions to the framers' thought was that God is the author of all law, physical laws and moral laws. And because of man's sinful nature, man departs from God's laws, and civil government is necessary to keep men within the confines of God's law. But in doing that, civil government is populated with men with the same sinful nature. So to keep government moderate, it is best to separate government power into 3 branches. This is where that concept comes from, the legislative, executive, and judicial. It's also found in the Bible in Isaiah 33:22. Christianity makes government more humane. So he seasons this whole formula together with Christianity, because that's what keeps us humane as humans. Our second most quoted human author here is William Blackstone at 7.9%. He was an Anglican, which was the Church of England, or Episcopalian as they were known of in the colonies. His main work was the commentaries on the laws of England, and the contribution to the framers' thoughts was a better understanding of this English common law and how it was applicable in the American courts. Judicial restraint was another topic that he discussed at length. Judges do not make law. They merely discover and apply the law. A great way to understand that is referees. Referees do not create the rules, but they are bound by the rules, and they are to apply the rules to the game and to the players. He came up with 3 categories of law in his writings, the first of which was the law of nature. And we get that from Scripture. When he created man and endued him with free will to conduct himself, said Blackstone, in all parts of life, he laid down certain immutable laws of human nature, whereby that free will is in some degree regulated and restrained, and gave him also the faculty of reason to discover the purpose of those laws. Secondly, we have revealed law. Now, this is because of God's compassion and mercy. We can't understand everything by looking into nature because nature is fallen. So God gave us His revealed law and made it plain and simple. He, that is God, gave us that in the Bible, such as the 10 Commandments. The doctrines thus delivered we call the revealed or divine law, and they are to be found only in Holy Scriptures, said Blackstone. Thirdly, there's municipal law. This is man-made law, and that is adopted by the civil governments, but it must conform to the higher law of God, said Blackstone. Upon these two foundations, the law of nature and the law of revelation, the Bible, depend all human laws. That is to say, no human law should be suffered to contradict these. Next in the line of human authors is John Locke. John Locke was raised in a Puritan family. He was basically Christian, though he was not entirely orthodox, and his main works that the founders cited were the first treatise on civil government, the second treatise on civil government, and then some would even consider him a theologian, as he wrote the essay concerning human understanding of St. Paul's epistles by consulting St. Paul himself, and also another work on the reasonableness of the Christian faith. His main contributions to the framers' thoughts were that government is established by covenant or contract of the people, and this was ultimately based upon, and I'm giving you a direct quote, that paction which God made with Noah after the deluge, and that's found in Genesis 9:6. And that whosoever sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he man. God has ordained the law of nature, to which all human laws must be subordinate. And thirdly, dealing with this law of nature, he discusses our God-given natural rights, and those are chiefly life, liberty, and property. Now we move on to other thinkers of international law, such as Grotius from Holland, Pufendorf from Germany, or Vattel, who is from Switzerland. They stress that international law must be based upon revealed law and the law of nature, again echoing Blackstone's sentiments. Our founders also quoted Roman thinkers, Virgil, Cicero, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius. These are those of which stress the virtue of the old Roman Republic and also the disciplines of that republic against the later excess of the empire. Discuss the political philosophies that sprang from these religious views that we discussed in our last lecture. The reliance, as an example, upon the laws of nature and nature's God. And the sources of this concept, first and foremost being the Bible. Founding Father Noah Webster summed up the definitions of these terms as the 10 Commandments written by the finger of God and the underwritten laws on your God-given conscience. In other words, there exists a higher law than the law of man by which man's law must be judged. As a matter of fact, the Declaration of Independence makes absolutely no sense unless there is a higher law than man's law, or the king's law at that particular time. Natural law is also predicated upon the existence of absolute truth. The point is that natural law limits government authority because, as we move into our next point, we have natural rights. So law is created literally to protect your rights. You can see how the law of nature would then limit an out-of-control government that would be encroaching upon your rights. As we discuss natural rights, we find that they are rooted in the law of nature. That's where we can find them. That's where we can look to. The source of natural rights, of course, is God. We have God-given rights. And this is based on man being created in the image of God, possessing human dignity. And this is also based on the negative commands of Scripture, thou shalt not kill. Thus you have the right to life given by God. He protects it by giving that law, thou shalt not kill. Natural rights existed as a limit on government authority. Remember that concept. Now, our natural rights consist of, but they're not just to be contained in, the following points. Number one, life. This is basic for exercising all other rights, which would include liberty. Liberty is defined by Noah Webster as the freedom to do what is right. Webster then defines right as according to the will of God. So liberty is not just the freedom to do as you please, but rather true liberty is the freedom to choose to do what is right according to the will of God. Property. This is not just material gain. This is a natural right, but it's not found in how much stuff I have. Property was viewed as a means of productivity by our framers and also by God. That's why He gives it and gives us the right to it. Property was viewed as an extension of the person. As an example, I work all day long mostly on a computer. That computer is my property. It's an extension of who I am, and therefore it helps me to do more things, to be more productive. Lastly, we come to the pursuit of happiness as basic natural rights. This included property, but it expanded upon that, and I believe Jefferson wanted that, and that's why he chose those words. This can be equated with the pursuit of virtue. Virtue is the only basis for genuine, lasting happiness. A non-virtuous person is not going to last long in happiness.
Now, wait a minute. You may be thinking, what is the mention of God and religion and morality and virtue doing here? Check out this video.
What role should religion play in a free society? More and more people today would answer, none. That would not have been the answer of the founders of the United States, the men who fought the American Revolution and wrote the country's Constitution. To them, the issue of religion and freedom were inextricably linked. You couldn't have freedom without religion. In fact, the political philosophy of the founders necessitated a divine foundation. Thomas Jefferson makes this clear in the Declaration of Independence when he writes that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. The purpose of government, Jefferson and his compatriots believed, was not to bestow rights. Rather, it was to protect those rights already endowed upon human beings by God. But government isn't enough for a free society. A moral people is also required. That is, a people moral enough to police itself. Virtue or morality, George Washington observed, is a necessary spring of popular government. Thus, for the founders, liberty was not merely the ability to do what one wanted. It came with moral demands and boundaries. They all accepted the rule of life expressed by Benjamin Franklin. Nothing brings more pain than too much pleasure, nothing more bondage than too much liberty. The founders knew that the absolute enemy of freedom was, ironically, a freedom that was absolute and unrestrained. And where was this restraint going to come from? Their answer was religion, which for them, because of when and where they lived, was some variety of Christianity. Let divines and philosophers, statesmen and patriots unite, Samuel Adams wrote, in instructing citizens in the art of self-government. In short, of leading them in the study and practice of the exalted virtues of the Christian system. The Christian system to which Adams refers is composed of Judeo-Christian values, the values rooted in the Old and New Testaments, both of which were referred to by the founders with equal conviction and frequency. Jefferson, yes, the very same Thomas Jefferson who is so often portrayed as anti-religious, confirmed this sentiment in his notes on the state of Virginia, when he asked, "Can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, and that they are not to be violated but with His wrath?" James Madison likewise affirmed the essential connection between religion and morality. The belief in a God all-powerful, wise, and good is essential to the moral order of the world and to the happiness of man. John Adams believed that the doctrine of a supreme, intelligent, wise, almighty sovereign of the universe, a doctrine he credited to Judaism, was the great essential principle of all morality and consequently of all civilization. And he applied this thinking specifically to the new nation he helped to create. Our Constitution, he said, was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. As president, he replied to a letter from university students in a way that would surprise many today. Science, liberty, and religion have an inseparable union. Without their joint influence, no society can be great, flourishing, or happy. Meanwhile, another founder, Alexander Hamilton, looked at the French Revolution and saw something much different. That revolution, unlike the American Revolution, had devolved into violence and chaos. Hamilton believed he understood why. The anti-religious force it unleashed, he wrote, annihilates the foundations of social order and true liberty, confounds all moral distinctions, and substitutes for the mild and beneficent religion of the gospel a gloomy, persecuting, and desolating atheism. For the founders, a free society divorced from religion simply could not work and would not survive. It is no wonder then that in his farewell address, George Washington chastised those who would claim to be patriots and yet undermine the influence of religion. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. The founders did not demand that anyone believe in any particular religion or even in God. Quite the contrary. But while they understood the value of a secular government, they feared a secular society, one without religion. So should we.
But what about the separation of church and state? It's in the Constitution, right? Wrong. Let's take a look.
Almost everyone has heard of the doctrine of the separation of church and state. Most Americans believe that it's in the United States Constitution. But there is no such phrase in the Constitution, and there never was, for a simple reason. The Founding Fathers never intended for church and state to be completely separate. They saw religion, specifically religions based on the Bible, as indispensable to the moral foundation of the nation they were creating. So where does that phrase come from? It comes from one brief letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist Association in 1802. At the end of a very long sentence in which Jefferson affirms his conviction that religious belief should be a private matter and that the government should not interfere with such matters, he uses the phrase, building a wall of separation between church and state. And that's where the phrase lived, undisturbed, lost in Jefferson's voluminous correspondence for almost 150 years. But more on that in a moment. First, let's discuss what the Constitution actually does say about religion and its role in public life. The answer is found in the First Amendment to the Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It's plain what those words mean. The federal government could not establish a national religion, the common practice in Europe. The United States was going to be different. Americans would be free to follow the religion of their choice. When James Madison first proposed what eventually became the First Amendment, his original wording was that no religion shall be established by Congress. But that language was later modified after it was pointed out that this might be taken to mean that the government, including the state governments, had no interest in religion at all. The founders did not want this. As George Washington said in his farewell address, religion and morality are indispensable supports of our political prosperity. Washington's view remained the nation's view throughout the 19th century and into the 20th. But that changed in 1947. In that year, in the case of Everson versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruled in a 5-4 decision that under the First Amendment, neither a state nor the federal government could pass laws which aid one religion, aid all religions, or prefer one religion over another. For the first time in American history, the First Amendment was not only about the prohibition of establishing a national religion, it was also about not giving any encouragement to any religion. The modern strict separation view was born. And where did the 5 justices look for support for their argument? Not the Constitution, because there was nothing in the Constitution to help them, but to that one phrase Thomas Jefferson wrote back in 1802. How ironic that the author of the Declaration of Independence, which recognizes the proposition that human beings have inalienable rights from their Creator and not from government, was now being used to separate religion from the public square. For Jefferson and the other founders, religion was central to the entire American project. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are just 2 of countless examples where the government acknowledges its debt to God. As the famously liberal Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas wrote in the case of Zorak versus Clausen just 5 years after the Everson decision, "We are a religious people whose institutions presuppose a supreme being." The founders would certainly have agreed. Following Everson, the nation's moral infrastructure began to crack, at first slowly and then more rapidly. In 1962, the Supreme Court struck another blow. It ruled in Engel versus Vitale that a generic school prayer violated the court's new definition of the First Amendment. Listen to the words of that school prayer. "Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee and we beg thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. Amen. The prayer was not specific to Christianity or to any religion. Since then, the separation of church and state metaphor has been used to remove God and religion piece by piece from American public life. Are we a better society for it? It's hard to argue that we are. Almost every cultural and ethical indicator, marriage rates, birth rates, the number of Americans giving to charity, has declined since God and religion have faded from American life. Meanwhile, children without fathers in their lives, behavioral problems in schools, and crime have gone up dramatically, and all because of one vote in one court case based on one sentence in one letter. On such things do nations and history turn. I'm John Eastman, professor of law at Chapman University and a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute for Prager University.
Now let's cover a few of the aspects of the Constitution that are most discussed today. First, there's a statement called the General Welfare Clause. Some think that this clause gives the government the power to regulate things like health care, marriage, and even the redistribution of wealth. Right? Wrong. Check out this video.
The General Welfare Clause does not give the federal government the power to do anything it wants. Where do the feds get the power to run things like healthcare or education or a retirement system? A lot of people will say, why, the General Welfare Clause gives it to them, of course. But if the General Welfare Clause empowers the federal government to do anything and everything, why would the framers of the Constitution follow that clause with a list of specific enumerated powers? Wouldn't the General Welfare Clause just cover it all? So why make a list in the first place? As Alexander Hamilton wrote in Federalist Paper number 83, the list of particulars in Article 1, Section 8 would be absurd as well as useless if a general authority was intended. He continued by saying the grant of specific powers following the General Welfare Clause evidently excludes all pretension to a general legislative authority. As James Madison put it in Federalist number 45, the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. If the General Welfare Clause gave the feds power to do anything under the guise of general welfare, it would turn the federal government into one of virtually unlimited power. It's clear that the specific powers enumerated after the clause limit the federal government's power to spend for the general welfare to specific objects. As Madison put it, to read it as a sweeping grant of power would be a metamorphosis of the Constitution into a character which there is a host of proofs was not contemplated by its creators.
Second, many believe that preborn children have no right according to the Constitution. Wrong. Check out this video.
The 1973 Supreme Court decision, Roe v. Wade, required states to allow abortion. The 7 men forming the majority said the right to privacy includes a woman's decision to end the life of her preborn child, effectively through all 9 months of pregnancy. This decision was widely criticized, even by legal scholars who support abortion. Notably, the justice who wrote the Roe v. Wade opinion, Harry Blackmun, made an important admission. He wrote, "If prenatal personhood is established, the case for abortion collapses, for the fetus's right to life would then be guaranteed specifically by the 14th Amendment." The 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868 after the Civil War to ensure that no human being would be denied basic constitutional rights. The amendment says states may not deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person the equal protection of the laws. So let's take up Justice Blackmun's challenge. Are preborn children persons within the original public meaning of the 14th Amendment? Let's use 3 different tools to answer this question. First, definitions from when the 14th Amendment was ratified. Second, historic state practices related to abortion. And third, the framers' understanding of the amendment. So first, definitions. According to dictionaries of common and legal usage at the time of the 14th Amendment's adoption, the term person was largely interchangeable with the term human being. The 1864 edition of Noah Webster's dictionary defined the term person as relating especially to a living human being, a man, woman, or child, an individual of the human race. No dictionary of the era referenced birth or the status of being born in its definition of person, man, or human being. In legal usage, every human being was considered a natural person. In his Discourse on the Rights of Persons, the authoritative treatise writer William Blackstone wrote, "Life is a right inherent by nature in every individual." For Blackstone, if human life existed, legal personhood existed also. There was no distinction between biological human life and legal personhood. Second, state practice. Centuries of English common law tradition consistently treated abortion as the wrongful killing of a human being. From her founding, the United States adopted this tradition and prohibited abortion as soon as human life could be detected. When the 14th Amendment was adopted in 1868, the states widely recognized unborn children as persons. Nearly every state had criminal legislation prohibiting abortion, and at least 28 jurisdictions labeled abortion as an offense against the person. 9 of the ratifying states explicitly valued the lives of the preborn and their pregnant mothers equally by providing the same range of punishment for killing either during the commission of an abortion. Furthermore, at least 10 states considered abortion to be either manslaughter, assault with intent to murder, or murder. In 23 states and 6 territories, laws referred to the preborn individual as a child. In fact, the same Ohio legislature that ratified the 14th Amendment called abortion at any stage nothing less than child murder. Thus, at the time of the 14th Amendment's adoption, nearly every state understood person to include prenatal life. Third, the framers' understanding of the amendment's legal application. The framers expected the 14th Amendment's guarantees of equal protection and due process would apply to every member of the human species within U.S. jurisdiction. Senator Jacob Howard, who sponsored the amendment in the Senate, declared the amendment's purpose was to disable a state from depriving not merely a citizen of the United States, but any person, whoever he may be, of life, liberty, or property without due process. Even the lowest and most despised of the human race were guaranteed equal protection. As Justice Hugo Black later put it, the history of the 14th Amendment proves that the people were told that its purpose was to protect weak and helpless human beings. Considering this evidence, it is clear Roe v. Wade was wrongly decided. Preborn children are constitutionally entitled to due process and the equal protection of the laws. The Constitution, properly interpreted, prohibits abortion under the 14th Amendment, and every constitutional officer who swears an oath to uphold the Constitution has a duty to ensure those rights are protected.
Third, isn't the Electoral College contrary to the Constitution? No, the Constitution created the Electoral College. Here's why.
All right, I know this doesn't sound like the most sensational topic of the day, but stay with me because I promise you it's one of the most important. To explain why requires a very brief civics review. The President and Vice President of the United States are not chosen by a nationwide popular vote of the American people. Rather, they are chosen by 538 electors. This process is spelled out in the United States Constitution. Why didn't the founders just make it easy and let the presidential candidate with the most votes claim victory? Why did they create, and why do we continue to need this electoral college? The answer is critical to understanding not only the electoral college, but also America. The founders had no intention of creating a pure majority-rule democracy. They knew from careful study of history what most have forgotten today or never learned. Pure democracies do not work. They implode. Democracy has been colorfully described as 2 wolves and a lamb voting on what's for dinner. In a pure democracy, bare majorities can easily tyrannize the rest of a country. The founders wanted to avoid this at all costs. This is why we have 3 branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. It's why each state has 2 senators, no matter what its population, but also different numbers of representatives based entirely on population. It's why it takes a supermajority in Congress and 3/4 of the states to change the Constitution. And it's why we have the Electoral College. Here's how the Electoral College works. The presidential election happens in 2 phases. The first phase is purely democratic. We hold 51 popular elections every presidential election year, 1 in each state and 1 in D.C. On Election Day in 2012, you may have thought you were voting for Barack Obama or Mitt Romney, but you were really voting for a slate of presidential electors. In Rhode Island, for example, if you voted for Barack Obama, you voted for the state's 4 Democratic electors. If you voted for Mitt Romney, you were really voting for the state's 4 Republican electors. Part 2 of the election is held in December, and it is this December election among the state's 538 electors, not the November election, which officially determines the identity of the next president. At least 270 votes are needed to win. Why is this so important? Because the system encourages coalition building and national campaigning. In order to win, a candidate must have the support of many different types of voters from various parts of the country. Winning only the South or the Midwest is not good enough. You cannot win 270 electoral votes if only one part of the country is supporting you. But if winning were only about getting the most votes, a candidate might concentrate all of his efforts in the biggest cities or the biggest states. Why would that candidate care about what people in West Virginia or Iowa or Montana think? But you might ask, isn't the election really only about the so-called swing states? Actually, no. If nothing else, safe and swing states are constantly changing. California voted safely Republican as recently as 1988. Texas used to vote Democrat. Neither New Hampshire nor Virginia used to be swing states. Most people think that George W. Bush won the 2000 election because of Florida. Well, sort of, but he really won the election because he managed to flip one state which the Democrats thought was safe, West Virginia. Its 4 electoral votes turned out to be decisive. No political party can ignore any state for too long without suffering the consequences. Every state, and therefore every voter in every state, is important. The Electoral College also makes it harder to steal elections. Votes must be stolen in the right state in order to change the outcome of the Electoral College. With so many swing states, this is hard to predict and hard to do. But without the Electoral College, any vote stolen in any precinct in the country could affect the national outcome, even if that vote was easily stolen in the bluest California precinct or the reddest Texas one. The Electoral College is an ingenious method of selecting a president for a great, diverse republic such as our own. It protects against the tyranny of the majority, encourages coalition building, and discourages voter fraud. Our founders were proud of it. We can be too.
Now I'd like to conclude with a topic that is being mentioned more and more these days: the United States as a democracy. Let's take a look.
When Benjamin Franklin exited the Constitutional Convention, he was asked by a woman, "Sir, what have you given us?" His immediate response was, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." Yet most Americans today have been persuaded that our nation's governmental system is a democracy and not a republic. The difference between these two is essential in understanding Americanism and the American system. Before we discuss political systems, however, it's helpful to address the confusion that has been spread about the political spectrum. Many have been led to believe that the political spectrum places groups such as communists on the far left, fascists or dictators on the far right, and political moderates or centrists in the middle. However, a more accurate political spectrum will show government having 0 power on the far right to having 100% power on the far left. At the extreme right, there is no government. The extreme left features total government under such labels as communism, socialism, Nazism, fascism, princes, potentates, dictators, kings, any form of total government. Those who claim that Nazis and fascists are right-wing never define their terms. This amounts to spreading confusion. Toward the middle of the political spectrum can be found the type of government limited to its proper role of protecting the rights of the people. That's where the Constitution of the United States is. Those who advocate such a form of government are really constitutional moderates. So let's analyze the basic forms of government. They are monarchy or dictatorship ruled by one, oligarchy ruled by a few, democracy ruled by a majority, republic ruled by law, and anarchy, which is ruled by no one. In discussing these five, we'll see that they can be narrowed down to even fewer. Looking first at monarchy or dictatorship, this form of government doesn't really exist in the practical sense. It's always a group that puts one of its members up front. A king has his council of nobles or earls, and every dictator has his bureaucrats or commissars, the men behind the scenes. This isn't ruled by one, even though one person may be the visible leader. It's ruled by a group. So let's eliminate monarchy, dictatorship, because it never truly exists. Oligarchy, which is ruled by a group, is the most common form of government in all history. And it is the most common form of government today. Most of the nations of the world are ruled by a powerful few, and therefore oligarchy remains. At the other end, we find anarchy, which means without government. Some people have looked over history and found that many of its worst crimes were committed by governments, so they decided that having no government might be a good idea. But this is a mistake, because as the ancient Greeks stated, without law there can be no freedom. Our founding fathers agreed and held that some amount of government is a necessary force in any civilized, orderly society. In a state of anarchy, however, everyone has to guard life, liberty, and property, and the lives of family members. Everyone must be armed, and movement is severely restricted because one's property has to be protected at all times. Civilized people have always hired someone to do the guarding, a sheriff, a police force, or some branch of government. Once law enforcement was in place, the people were freer. They could leave their property, work in the fields, and so on. In short, the proper amount of government makes everyone freer. There are some who advocate anarchy, however, not because they want no government, but because they don't like what they have. They use anarchy as a tool for revolutionary change. The condition of anarchy is very much like a vacuum where something rushes in to fill it. These calculating anarchists work to break down the existing government with rioting, killing, looting, and terrorism. Tragically, the people living in such chaos often go to those best able to put an end to it and beg them to take over and restore order. And who is best able to put an end to the chaos? The very people who started it. The anarchists who created the problem then create a government run by them, an oligarchy, where they have total power. This is exactly what happened in Russia that led to Lenin taking total power, and in Germany, where Hitler's brown shirts created the chaos that brought him to power. But anarchy isn't a stable form of government. It's a quick transition from something that exists to something desired by the power-hungry. It's a temporary condition, and because it isn't permanent, we eliminate it as well. The word democracy comes from two Greek words, demos, meaning people, and kratein, meaning to rule. Democracy, therefore, means the rule of the people, majority rule. This, of course, sounds good, but suppose the majority decides to take away one's home, or business, or children. Obviously, there has to be a limit. The flaw in democracy is that the majority isn't restrained. If more than half the people can be persuaded to want something in a democracy, they rule. What about republic? Well, that comes from the Latin, res meaning thing, and publica meaning public. It means the public thing, the law. A true republic is one where the government is limited by law, leaving the people alone. America's founders had a clean slate to write on. They could have set up an oligarchy. In fact, there were some who wanted George Washington to be their king. But the founding fathers knew history, and they chose to give us the rule of law in a republic, not the rule of a majority in a democracy. Why? Let's demonstrate the difference in the setting of the Old West. Consider a lynch mob in a democracy. 35 horseback riders chase one lone gunman. They catch him, and they vote 35-1 to hang him. Democracy has triumphed, and there's one less gunman to contend with. Now consider the same scenario in a republic. The 35 horseback riders catch the gunman and vote 35-1 to hang him, But the sheriff arrives, and he says, "You can't kill him. He's got his right to a fair trial." So they take the gunman back to town. A jury of his peers is selected, and they hear the evidence and the defense, and they decide if he shall hang. Does the jury even decide by majority rule? No, it has to be unanimous, or he goes free. The rights of the gunman aren't subject to majority rule, but to the law. This is the essence of a republic. Many Americans would be surprised to learn that the word democracy does not appear in the Declaration of Independence or the U.S. Constitution, nor does it appear in any of the constitutions of the 50 states. The founders did everything they could to keep us from having a democracy. James Madison, rightly known as the father of the Constitution, wrote in essay number 10 of the Federalist Papers, "Democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths." Alexander Hamilton agreed, and he stated, "We are a republican government. Real liberty is never found in despotism or in the extremes of democracy." Samuel Adams, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, stated, "Democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself." The founders had good reason to look upon democracy with contempt, because they knew that the democracies in the early Greek city-states produced some of the wildest excesses of government imaginable. Thus, democracy itself is not a stable form of government. Instead, it is the gradual transition from limited government to the unlimited rule of an oligarchy. Knowing this, we as Americans are ultimately left with only two choices. We can keep our republic, as Franklin put it, or we will inevitably end up with an oligarchy, a tyranny of the elite.
Thanks for your attention today. Hopefully, you are now more informed about the basis for American law, the United States Constitution. This is Jim Siegel signing off for now. So long.